Michel Foucault, the watchtower that runs itself once you stop looking for the guard. Picture a prison designed so that every inmate can be watched at any moment from a single central tower, but no inmate can ever tell whether anyone is actually in the tower looking at them right now. What happens to a person's behavior once they simply cannot rule out being watched at all times?
They start guarding themselves, constantly, whether anyone is actually there or not. And that single design, and what it does to the human mind, became the central image of one of the most influential and most argued about thinkers of the 20th century.
Michel Foucault, born in France in 1926. Give us the shape of his project first, because he covered an unusually wide range of subjects.
Foucault spent his career studying institutions most historians had treated as simply humane progress: the asylum, the hospital, the prison, the school, and asking a much sharper question underneath the polite official story. Not just, did treatment get more humane over time, but what new forms of control and observation replaced the older, cruder forms of punishment? His answer, across several major books, is that modern institutions did not simply become gentler. They became more thorough, reaching further into the everyday behavior and even the private thoughts of the people inside them.
Take the prison specifically, since you opened with it, because that is where his most famous idea lies.
In Discipline and Punish, published in 1975, Foucault traces the shift from public execution and torture, brutal spectacles meant to terrify a crowd into obedience, toward the modern penitentiary, built around constant surveillance, timetables, and internalized discipline rather than open physical violence. His central image for that shift is the panopticon, a prison design actually proposed by the philosopher Jeremy Bentham in the late 1700s, a circular building with cells arranged around a central observation tower, backlit so guards can see every prisoner, while prisoners can never see whether the tower is currently occupied.
And Bentham's design was not just a thought experiment either.
Bentham genuinely tried for years to get it built and funded as an actual working prison in England. And while his exact design was never fully realized as he envisioned it, panopticon-inspired layouts influenced real prison architecture across multiple countries well into the 20th century. Foucault's point in reviving it was not really about architecture for its own sake. It was that the panopticon is a machine for making people discipline themselves, because uncertainty about being watched does the guard's job even when no guard is actually watching, and he argued that same logic had quietly spread far beyond prison walls, into schools, factories, hospitals, and the modern workplace.
This is where his idea of power and knowledge being intertwined comes in, which is a genuinely dense concept. Try to make it land simply.
Foucault's argument is that knowledge is never simply neutral, objective truth sitting apart from power, waiting to be discovered. What counts as legitimate medical knowledge, legitimate criminal psychology, legitimate education, gets shaped by institutions that also hold real power over the people being studied, classified, and treated. A doctor deciding who is mentally ill is not simply applying neutral science. That decision is also an exercise of institutional power over that person's freedom. Knowledge and power in his account are not opposites, one constraining the other. They constantly produce each other.
And this connects to his broader term, governmentality.
Governmentality is Foucault's word for how modern states govern not primarily through direct commands and punishment, but through shaping norms, managing populations, structuring the everyday choices available to people, public health campaigns, census data, statistics about a population's health and behavior, all of which let a government manage citizens' conduct at a distance, often with citizens actively participating in their own management, filling out the forms, following the recommended guidelines, without needing to be forced at every step.
Now, Foucault's own life and legacy are genuinely contested, and serious sources should not paper over that.
They should not, and it is important to say this plainly rather than tucking it into a footnote. Foucault has faced serious, documented criticism, including disturbing allegations regarding his conduct and relationships, particularly during time he spent in Tunisia, that many scholars and journalists have examined and taken seriously in recent years. Academically, his historical claims have also faced substantial pushback. Historians of psychiatry and medicine have argued some of his portrayals of the asylum and the birth of clinical medicine oversimplify, or selectively read the historical record to fit his broader theoretical argument. None of that erases the influence of his ideas, but any honest account of Foucault has to hold his genuinely important insights and these serious, documented criticisms at the same time, rather than choosing one and ignoring the other.
That is an important complication to sit with rather than rush past. Let us bring the actual theory down to something people can feel day to day, because the panopticon idea is more intuitive than it first sounds.
Think about the difference between an open plan office where the manager's desk faces the entire room, everyone visible at a glance, versus one where the manager sits behind a closed door and only occasionally walks the floor. People in the first office, most studies of workplace behavior suggest, tend to look busier, more consistently, even when the manager is not actually looking their way at that exact moment, simply because they cannot be sure they are not being observed. That is Foucault's panopticon logic playing out on carpet tile instead of stone, uncertainty about observation doing more behavioral work than actual, constant watching ever could.
And this maps almost perfectly onto a huge modern debate: workplace surveillance software.
Almost exactly. Modern employee monitoring tools, tracking keystrokes, screen activity, location, even measuring time spent away from a desk, are a direct, technologically supercharged descendant of the panopticon principle. Workers regulating their own behavior because they cannot be certain when or how closely they are being watched. Defenders argue this is simply reasonable oversight, protecting productivity and security in an era of remote work. Critics argue it corrodes trust and autonomy, training workers into constant low-grade self-surveillance, whether or not the monitoring is actually catching anything meaningful. Both sides are, whether they know it or not, arguing directly inside Foucault's framework.
And the smartphone in everyone's pocket adds a whole other layer to that same argument.
It genuinely does. Location tracking, health data, browsing history, all quietly logged by default on most devices, extend that same uncertain, ambient sense of being observed into essentially every hour of a person's day, well beyond any single workplace or institution. Foucault died in 1984, well before any of this technology existed, and yet his framework predicts almost exactly how people behave differently, more cautiously, more self-edited, once they know constant tracking is technically possible, even without knowing whether anyone specific is checking that data at any given moment.
And there is a genuinely urgent, unresolved current events version of this too.
Ongoing debates about AI-driven surveillance and predictive policing sit squarely inside Foucault's territory. Systems that analyze patterns of movement, purchases, or online behavior to flag individuals as higher risk before any crime has occurred raise exactly the questions Foucault spent his career on. Who decides what counts as suspicious knowledge? What power that classification hands to institutions over people's lives? And how much self-censoring, self-editing behavior spreads through a population, simply because people suspect such systems might be watching, whether or not they actually are in any given moment. Supporters argue these tools genuinely prevent harm and allocate limited resources more efficiently. Critics argue they encode existing biases into supposedly neutral technology and expand exactly the kind of soft, ambient control Foucault warned modern institutions specialize in. That fight is playing out in courts and legislatures worldwide right now, entirely unresolved.
So what is the honest, motivating reason to actually take Foucault seriously, given everything, the genuine insight and the genuine controversy both?
Because he trains you to ask a question most people never think to ask about the institutions running their daily life. Not simply, is this rule fair, but what is this design actually doing to my behavior, my self-image, and my sense of being watched, independent of whether anyone is enforcing anything at that exact moment? Once you notice that pattern in an office, a school, an app, you cannot entirely stop noticing it.
Which sets up a natural next turn, Because our next thinker took this whole conversation about power operating quietly through institutions and pointed it somewhere Foucault mostly left alone: taste, education, and the small daily habits that quietly decide who belongs in which room.
Where Foucault asked how institutions discipline bodies and behavior, our next thinker asks how something as seemingly harmless as which wine you order or which university you attended ends up doing an enormous amount of the exact same sorting work.
Next time, Pierre Bourdieu, and the uncomfortable argument that inequality does not only run on money, it runs on taste. See you then.